This is the first video of the Introduction to IFS, or Internal Family Systems Theory video series. In this first video, I want to offer you a bird's eye view or overview of the whole approach, the whole theory underlying internal family system. For this, I want to cover questions like, what is IFS, or the internal family systems? What are the core concepts? And I want to really introduce you to my way of visualizing the internal family system so you can have an easy way to get a deep understanding of the theory. But before I do that, I want to offer a few quick remarks about me. So I've been using IFS, or the internal family system, in my personal practice, mostly coaching practice, for the past 5 years. I've been teaching a form of parts work that is deeply influenced by the internal family system for people searching for personal growth and coaches for about 3 years now. 3 years ago, I also recorded a whole introductory series about the internal family systems that has gathered more than 100,000 views, which is incredible to me. And basically, these videos I'm recording now are an update to these older videos using my new approach for visualization. That's the very short overview about me. Let's get into the theory. Starting off with a short definition. The way I understand it, IFS, or the Internal Family Systems Therapy, I'm going to use the abbreviation from now on more, is two things. It's an approach to psychotherapy, so it is a step-by-step or larger approach of how therapists, and by now more and more coaches and also body workers, are working with clients and with problems clients are coming with. And it is a theory of the psyche, meaning it's a theory of how our psyche, our mind is built, and how problems, solutions, high performance, all of that can be created in our psyche. And both of these, the theory of the psyche and the approach to psychotherapy, were developed by Richard Schwartz, who's still very much at the head of the IFS Institute, the Internal Family Systems Institute, and still developing this further. Now, this series will focus very strongly on the theory and model of the psyche that is offered through the internal family systems. I'm going to speak very little about explicit steps in therapy, in coaching. I'm going to speak very little about questions you can ask, etc. I have a whole second series coming about that. But I want you to first have a solid understanding of how people using the internal family systems are looking at humans, are looking at the psyche, and what these perspectives allow us to do and how they allow us to interact with problematic or helpful behavior people are showing. And I think the most important starting point when talking about IFS is to start with saying that it is based on a multiplicity paradigm. What does that mean? Now, the multiplicity paradigm basically means that in internal family systems, we look at the human mind as naturally organized into multiple sub-personalities, which IFS calls parts, meaning we don't look as humans, or healthy humans, as having one personality and that they should always be the same, but rather than that, we look at them as having different parts. I'm going to visualize them as these round things, and different parts will be active or influencing us at different times. And when different parts are active, or another term that's used for that I will explain later, blended with us, we will show different characteristics that belong to these different parts. This multiplicity paradigm wasn't the starting point for Richard Schwartz's work or the result of intense philosophical thought. It was much rather what he found people were naturally displaying and explaining to him when he was listening to them about the challenges in their inner world. And it might be easiest to start off with a small story or example here. So one field that Richard Schwartz was working in was the field of eating disorders. So people who'd been in serious psychotherapeutic treatment, often for years, but had problems getting beyond bulimia, anorexia, and other self-harming behaviors, often including things like cutting themselves, etc. And once he stepped beyond his paradigm of family therapy, which is a paradigm where you don't talk to people as much or ask them about what's going on in their inner world, and he asked them about what's happening inside of them, a lot of his patients, a lot of the people he was working with, explained their inner behavior or talked about their inner behavior in form of parts. So one example, or one could be that a client would talk about, yesterday I had a bad day, and once I got home, the cutting part just took over, and it cut me, and through that I could feel better. I actually felt the pain, I felt myself again, and that was good for a moment. So they explained that this part of them took over, did something to them or through them, and many different patients would explain similar things around an eating part, a binging part, etc., etc. But then, to continue this story, the problem was, once I was feeling myself again, suddenly another part started criticizing me for being so weak, for falling into the same patterns and the same problems again, and I started feeling a lot of shame. So they would suddenly describe that there was not just the cutting part that was doing something, but there might be a different part, in this case, a part that is criticizing them, and that even though the cutting helped for some of their symptoms, the critical part then got louder, which actually created its own form of symptoms. Richard Schwartz discovered that a lot of people would talk about their inner world as these different parts that had different influences, and that would lead to interactions and reactivity between these parts. And this is really the foundation of what IFS has become to be, is this understanding that we all have these different parts. This discovery of patients having different parts, and that these parts were doing things and that they were interacting with each other, was incredibly interesting to Richard Schwartz. And he followed the evidence, as he calls it, by exploring more about these parts and about how they influenced people's experiences and behaviors. And through doing that, he discovered that there were different types of parts that would show up in patients and that would be connected to the symptoms and problems they were displaying. And these different types of parts he defined, you can look at as kind of functional definitions. So it's not like Richard Schwartz or the internal family system would look, oh, we all have an inner child, and we have a good child, and we have a bad child, and we have a hurt child. It's more like there are different functions that parts can take on in our psyche, and by looking at them through the lens of these different functions, we can more clearly understand what they're doing or why they're acting a certain way. And the most foundational or basic distinction between different parts that Richard Schwartz found is the distinction between protectors, being parts that are doing certain things, trying to protect us, the system, meaning trying to do certain things so that people like us and don't dislike us, or trying to protect us from certain emotions that we still have unprocessed in our system coming back up. So protectors are basically active parts that are doing things, trying to make sure we don't have certain experiences happening to us or certain feelings popping back up inside of us. And exiles, being parts that are not actively doing something, not actively trying to protect us, but rather parts that are stuck somewhere and often carrying old burdens, or always carrying old burdens, meaning old feelings, beliefs, experiences from the past we couldn't digest back then. So looking through this lens, he discovered that there are these exiles inside of us that are often carrying strong emotions or beliefs about ourselves, and then there are protectors that are trying to work really hard in whatever way, trying to make sure that number one, these feelings don't come back up again. And number two, that things don't happen to us in our life that would make us feel similarly again. And this distinction alone, the distinction between protectors and exiles, allows us to understand a kind of systemic or inherent organization of our inner system. And if we continue this little story with the cutting part and the critical part, we might look at it as this cutting part trying to cut and thus create a certain reaction. Oftentimes the cutting can be soothing to the system. It can actually allow people to feel themselves again, etc. All of those being kind of positive results that people might expect through that behavior. So the part is doing that in order to avoid feeling this exile, in order to avoid feeling shamed, feeling annihilated, feeling deep sadness, whatever it is that part might be carrying. So looking at it through those functions, this part is doing something, trying to protect the system from this old feeling that the exile might be carrying. And then this part is trying to protect the system by making sure, hey, this is not helpful either, do something different. So both parts are actually trying to do something helpful to the system with different exact goals, but always, and this is a very important foundation of the internal family systems, always with a positive intent, meaning that all the protectors we have, no matter how dysfunctional, how painful, how extreme their behavior is, all the protectors we have always have a positive intent, meaning they want to avoid bad things happening to us in real life, or they want to avoid specific emotions and exiles, beliefs coming to the surface so we feel bad again because of things we couldn't digest in the past. And having this perspective of there are parts that are carrying things we couldn't digest in the past, and there are parts that are trying to protect us from bad things happening and these old emotions coming back up, allows us to have an incredibly non-pathologizing perspective of looking at what's happening in people, rather than looking at their symptoms as stupid or something we have to fight against. We can look at things like cutting, like eating disorders, but also like completely overworking, like being incredibly nice to people all the time. All of these different ways of behaving, we can look at them as parts trying to do something positive, something helpful for our system. And when we put on that perspective, we suddenly look at things happening in ourselves and in others from a completely different point of view. So IFS offers a very non-pathologizing perspective of looking at our psyche, and it offers a very empowering perspective, because by looking at us as having these different parts, number one, we can suddenly understand our inner world a lot more than looking at it, why am I behaving like this one day and like that another day, which can be very confusing and actually challenging to try to understand that. And as we will see in later videos, it actually allows a very clear path of action that we can take internally and with clients or patients to help them get better. So Richard Schwartz discovered there are protectors, there are exiles, and I want to offer a little bit more detail, especially about the protectors, because he discovered that there are two different types of protectors, which he called the managers and the firefighters. Now, the managers are proactive protectors, meaning they try to organize and often control our life proactively so that bad things don't happen to us, or old emotions, exiles don't come up from the depths. So by proactively working and controlling, in this case, as an example, by having a very long to-do list and constantly working on it, these parts are trying to make sure we're safe, we're well off, and these old emotions don't come up. On the other hand, firefighters are not proactive, they are reactive, meaning firefighters are parts that come up once certain emotions are starting to come to the surface, once certain exiles are starting to come up, and try to do everything reactively to stop that. So reactive behaviors could be something like watching a lot of TV, numbing out, zoning out. It could be eating, binging. It could be excessive sport. It could be sex. It could be anything. As long as that behavior, that strategy helps us to not feel what is coming up. Now, in my visualization, I kind of try to show this by saying that managers look into life, so they look out into the world, even though they still look out into the world through the lens they've learned in the past, whereas firefighters are kind of looking towards the exiles and trying to react once they have to if the exiles are coming up. And if we take that perspective, that there are exiles that are still carrying old pain, there are parts, protectors, trying to make sure that bad things don't happen to us and this old pain doesn't come up. More detail, there are managers, there are firefighters. We can actually start to understand that symptoms people are showing and dysfunction in their life, in their relationships, in their inner psyche is caused by parts with a positive intent. And I'm going to go into positive intent a lot in coming videos. They are caused by parts trying to manage life and trying to manage charge we are carrying in our system. Basically, these parts might be creating problematic, symptomatic behavior in our life because we are still carrying this vulnerability in our system, and because they have to, and often years and years and years and years ago, had to find ways of dealing with that charge. That's the very simple, non-pathologizing way of looking at problems people have in their lives. And now that I've talked a lot about parts, I want to talk about the one additional element of the whole theoretical model that IFS is offering that I find incredibly helpful, incredibly transformative, and actually paradigm shifting, which is the self. IFS has the perspective, and for all of those who are practicing IFS as an approach, we have the experience that all humans, we all have a self. We all have a spiritual core that is not just there somewhere, but actually that can be actively present and actively involved in sessions. When we're coaching somebody, when we're working with somebody, the part can be and should be an active part of the process. And yes, we all have different parts, protectors, exiles, but we also all have a self. And discovering this was actually a surprise to Richard Schwartz. This was not like he went into the work saying, oh yeah, there must be a self somewhere. But he discovered that as soon as the different parts, protectors especially, but also exiles, that are creating challenge, relax. Meaning when they're not here taking over the system, but they relax, step aside a little bit, the self is present. One of the quotes that hit me when I first started reading about IFS was this quote saying, they were all the same person underneath. So when the parts step aside, there is something within us, this spiritual core, this self that we have, that we are, that changes how we interact, how we react, how we can relate to humans and parts, etc. And this is a very important element of the IFS perspective, which I will go into with a lot more detail in the coming videos. And that's it for now. The rest of this whole series, which is going to cover a few videos, is based on these few concepts. basically we all have many different parts. We all have one self. And I now, through the next videos, want to go into depth into what are protectors, how do they work, what are exiles, what do we need to know about them, what about the self, etc., etc. But this is the foundation for the rest of this video series. I hope you enjoyed this. If this is helpful for you, feel free to share it with others. And thank you very much for watching.
You never know what's around the next corner. So.